Good evening, everyone. I'm beginning the live stream, and then we will begin. Lovely to see you all on the Zoom this evening, and a lot of faces, which is great. It's always good to see people's faces. If your bandwidth can take it, and you're okay, then do leave your cameras on. Happy for you to relax and eat and all those things whilst we're on together. Don't worry about that on camera. Okay, so good evening, everyone. The live stream has begun, and so then let's begin as well. Okay, I have to start just with a total disclosure, is that there's far too much to talk about this week in this week's parsha, both in the context of filling in everything that we've discussed so far, but also the parsha is so replete with lullabies to chase away and issues to address that it's going to be difficult to fit everything in to an hour's slot. So let's kind of conceptualize this evening as an opportunity to begin sort of sketching out ways of thinking, ways of making connections, and also ways of opening things up. But don't think that the conversation ends tonight. Really think of this as the beginning rather than the end. Though this will almost be the end of our discussion for this year of the Abraham part of this story, as next week we segue into the life of his son, Isaac. However, this week we do have sort of the finale, the climax of Abraham's story, with some of the most difficult and famous passages in the entire Torah. And you will, and just before I start, and I just jumped in, and that was slightly hasty of me, I wanted to just pull back and say, we are all reeling, and we are all grieving over the loss of Harav Yaakov Tzvi ben David Aryeh, the loss of Rabbi Lord Sachs, who passed away far too young on Shabbos. And many of us have been inspired by his teaching, inspired by his presentations, his broadcasts, his Torah, the ideas that he shared with us. My family's connection with Rabbi Sachs goes all the way back to his days of holidaying in Margate, when he was a slightly older boy to my father, and they used to play on the beach together. He has been an inspiration to the rabbinate, certainly inspiration to my uncle, who's a rabbi in Baltimore, a great inspiration to him and a great inspiration to me as well, and to many rabbis across the world, to many people across the world, to thousands. And I think, not only was his inspiration felt within the Jewish community, but it's also felt without. I think it must have been a rare time throughout Jewish history that someone was able to articulate the beauty, the splendor, and the meaning of Judaism, not just to their nation, but also to other nations as well. What a light unto the nations Rabbi Sachs is, and what I'm sure will continue to be through the teaching that he has put out into this world. And he's a prolific writer, broadcaster. There's so much available on YouTube. There's so much available in print that one can enjoy. I know that his soul will be elevated and elevated and elevated through the next decades and longer, as people continue to learn and gain succor and gain meaning from his wisdom. So may the Torah that we share tonight, may it be an aliyah, also an elevation to the soul of that very, very special man, Rav Yaakov Tzvi ben David Aryeh, and he will continue to touch all our lives. Last week, we continued our discussion of the foibles of creation, or rather we continued our discussion of what it would mean to be human, what it means to be someone who is created in the image of God, someone who is given this amazing gift, this amazing ability to be a creator. We said that a human is created b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God. What does it mean to be created in the image of God? It means that we do what God does. What did God do when he created humanity? What do we know about God up to that point? All we know about God is that he creates, he is a creator. So too, the one thing that we are understanding from the perspective of God is that God is a creator. So he's a creator up until now, so we are creators as well. We are mini creators. And we spoke out what is the danger of creativity. The danger of creativity is that it can become narcissistic. It can become about me. It can become about my own creativity. We saw that possibly in the context of the garden and also in the context of Noah, but though we didn't go into that in quite as much depth, rather what we started talking about then was a sort of overlapping but linked concept. And I think what we're going to try and do today is link together some of the different concepts that float around the garden, that float around the flood, but haven't always been linked together. What we talked about from the very beginning, though, was this idea of a unified whole, individuating out into separate pieces and then coming back again. And so we said that what happened with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, what happened with Noah, was that there was this whole, there was this sort of unified whole called God, the source of everything. Everything sort of starts to separate out into individuate. I suppose be the best creators they can be the most independent creators they can be. But in independence is the great trap, that my independence can force me to almost become inured, to become accustomed, to become comfortable with that separation, to be accustomed to my own creativity as I am, and to become narcissistic in that sense. And so when Adam and Eve separated out, they separated out too far. They moved actually from a world of truth and false, true and false, of emet and sheker, of truth, and instead moved into a world of good and bad. If you want to think about what they did, they individuated even further, living in a world of true and false, which is what we talked about in the first week. That's a world of objectivity. In that world, in a certain sense, my creativity, my independence is limited. My ability to separate out myself is constrained by the very fact that I see things so clearly. I see true and false. I see like God sees. So therefore, my creativity is somewhat, my wings are clipped. My creativity is somewhat hemmed in by virtue of the fact that I see things in such a clear way. I don't see it as me, but I want to see things as me, because creativity is seductive. Creativity is desirous. There's a desire in there. I lust after the fruit, to know between good and evil. I lust after subjectivity because it feels so good to create for me. If you want to think about it in a different sort of context, you might say, I'm at work, I'm doing a project. I believe in the project. The project is doing good things, right? I'm a rabbi of a shul, and I'm doing good work. I'm doing good work in the world. I'm trying to do important things for my community. Now, I could say that good work it's my work and it's my success. Or I could say it's God's work. It's true work. Now, it's very, very important to do God's work. It's seductive to do my work. Does that make sense? Right? So it's the program that inspires people to feel connected to their creator. The sermon that brings tears to a person's eyes and makes them feel elated and connected to Hashem. So that feels amazing on two levels. It feels amazing on the level of being a tool of the creator to spread his goodness. It feels also good to be able to sort of make your own project and touch people. That's a tricky place to be. That's a place in between subjectivity on the one hand, my own sense of self, my own creativity, my presentation, or objectivity and truth on the other. This is good work. This is good work. But there is a seduction in saying it's my work. Okay, that was my own personal disclosure and of that tension. And so then that carries through that Adam and Eve, they push themselves out there. They want greater individuation. In actual fact, they're thinking it's a challenge. Maybe by individuating further and further and further, by becoming more and more subjective, I eat from the fruit of the tree of good and evil to know the knowledge of good and evil. So then I can individuate further, and that's going to make it all the more sweet when I come back. It's going to make it all the more sweet when I can actually purify my head and only think about the Creator's mission rather than thinking about mine. However, God seemingly finds that distance very problematic. That distance then creates a curse. There's that separation which is felt. But that Noah comes to comfort everyone too. Noah is the person who creates the plow. His father names him Noah. This one will comfort us, will offer us comfort. He creates the plow to comfort them with their separation from God. God says this is the final straw. They don't understand. Adam and Eve at least thought in their heads that the separation was going to then eventually bring them back to me. They've just become comfortable with the separation. They're just happy with the relationship being on the rocks. They're not there to mend it. We're going to have to start again. And so he starts again. And he creates a new project whereby this time it's not going to be the whole of humanity that is going to try and separate out and come back, but it's going to be a particular individual that has shown promise in this area. He's shown promise in the area of managing his subjectivity, of managing his own innate sort of desire for himself with his creativity. Why? Because this individual, as we learned last week, has decided that he's going to dedicate his biological productivity to his dead brother. His brother Haran died prematurely. His brother left behind 3 children, Lot, Yiscah, and Milcah. Yiscah, who also is known as Sarai, Sarai meaning my princess, Yiscah also meaning princess, Yiscah meaning the deep, beautiful princess. Hi. So anyway, so Yiscah, she is Abraham's new wife, and she is going, and what's Abraham doing? He's saying that the greatest creativity that I can have is to create life. You know, it's just an interesting point. I've been discussing with a number of people the topic of faith, and one of the things, faith in God, and how in a world that is replete with scientific explanation, we still cannot explain certain basic things without a belief in an intelligent designer. One of those, which science is entirely at a loss to explain, is the origin of life. They can explain, even if you say that evolution is sufficient to describe the progression from bacteria to amoeba all the way through to monkey and then human, which it isn't. But even if you were to suggest such a thing, how did you get life in the first place? It is an impossibility, and it's not something that anyone has been able to explain. So God is the creator of life. We can also create life. We can also bring children into this world. So that capacity is one of the greatest acts of creativity or expressions of creativity a person has. And we all feel this sometimes, that when those who have either have their own children or are the child of others, so then there is a certain sense where parents and children get into a tug of war of who is who, right? Am I really an individual, or is my mother still nagging me about like things that she used to nag me about? It doesn't matter. So, you know, and you have that conversation, Mum, I'm an adult, and she says, but I'm still your mother. So, you know, there is that sense that I'm still hers, like she owns me, she's in charge of me. Then I just have 2 women in my life that rule me, and therefore that's fine. But in any case, it's it's the night for all to share tonight. So in any case, mothers feel that they own their children, or parents feel they own their children, and there's a real sense of, can I let go? So why? Because that I made you, I gave everything to you, I gave you life, and that's also one of the reasons that we honor parents. One of the reasons we honor parents is, even if it doesn't matter if that, whatever that parent does, there's a mitzvah to honor one's parents because they gave us life. Okay, so that creativity that Abraham has, he gives freely to his brother. I will make a child with your daughter in order to perpetuate your legacy. This is not about me. It's not about my legacy. It's not about my creativity. In kindness and in goodness, I will give my creativity to you. Abraham doesn't just express that creativity, that giving, that kindness that is his trademark with his niece, Sarah, with his niece, Sarai, Yiscah, who also therefore seemingly is a very deeply kind individual by also marrying her uncle and deciding to perpetuate the legacy of her father in that way. So they don't just perpetuate the legacy, they don't just give up their legacy in that way, but they also, in terms of their technological creativity, in terms of their passions and talents that they bring into this world, so then they also designate those things for God, as we learned last week, that Abraham builds altars and pitches tents. It's the opposite of what the tower builders do in the Tower of Babel. In the Tower of Babel, the tower builders want to establish for themselves a name. They want to make a legacy for themselves. They are interested in their name. Abraham is interested in God's name. So both in Abraham's technological creativity, which is the other source of our great creativity, it's not our ability to produce, it's our ability to build. Once again, that's what God did. God did two things. He built a world and he created life, right? So he created the world and built whatever. Either way, he made the world and he made life. And again, if you want to come to talk about why you need to explain a God source, we talked about the probability of the existence of this complex universe coming about from non-complex parts and then happening to arrange themselves into the great complexity we have today as a probability of 10 to 123, which is, if you were to write that number on every proton and neutron in the world, you'd still not have enough in the universe. You still not have enough protons and neutrons to write the number on. That's the improbability of this thing happening by chance and the Big Bang just happening by chance and all those different things. So God's building power and God's creating life power, those are the two things that we share on some miniature level, that we can both also have the capacity to create life and also have the capacity to build technological advancement. Do we use those capacities, those abilities? Do we use those to build our own legacies and to build our own subjectivity, our own sense of self, our own seductive legacy, or do we do it for others? Do we do it for a greater purpose? As an aside, I'm clearly thinking about this at the moment. When you have someone like Rabbi Sachs, who an amazing personal legacy, when you met him, it wasn't about Rabbi Sachs, right? When you met him, it was about ideas. It was about issues. It was about transmitting Torah messages to the broader public. It was about improving the world, making the world a better place, healing a fractured world. That was his raison d'etre. It wasn't about becoming Rabbi Lord Sachs, that Chief Rabbi Lord Sachs, right? Templeton Prize, that wasn't the point. Rabbi Sachs didn't go into this thinking, do you know what, I'll write loads of books so I can win £1 million or $1 million in the Templeton Prize. No, he went into this thinking, I need to spread light in the world. By the way, when people do that, that makes an amazing legacy for them. But that's not the point. The point isn't about becoming Chief Rabbi Lord Sachs, Templeton Prize winner. The point is about spreading goodness, spreading light, healing society. Other people, and as Pirkei Avot says, those who run from kavod, kavod runs to them. Those who run away from their own honor runs to them, because those are the sort of people that you're really interested in making a difference in the world. However, we said that Abraham still has a test. It's not like this is the easiest thing in the world. I'll just take all my ability, all my talent, I'll just give it to my brother, I'll just give it to God. It's all fine. It's all fine. I'll just do good and everything, all the good will come to me. It'll be fine. I'll just do what I need to do and that'll be it. There's no seductive power of my own legacy. There's no test there. Undoubtedly, Abraham was an incredibly talented man. That's why he was the forefather of the Jewish people. With talent, with ability, comes a knowledge of what I could do, what I could do, what I subjectively could do. And then that's even, that problem is propelled, is really put front and center when Abraham is promised children. He's promised a legacy. God says, you are going to be the father of nations. And there's one problem, that whatever he does, it seems to be frustrated and thwarted. It seems to be frustrated and thwarted by reality. As soon as we hear that Abraham decides to marry Sarai, to marry Yiska, same person, we hear that she's unable to have children. All the goodwill in the world isn't going to get over infertility. All the kindness in the world isn't going to change biological facts. And so, where we left off the story last week was Abraham maybe thinking that his legacy isn't going to be through Sarah. I've been promised a legacy. I know it's not just for me, it's for God. I'm doing this for God, I'm doing this for my brother, but we can't have kids. We can't have kids. Like, we've been trying and trying and trying and trying, and it's just not happening. And then we get to a point where Sarah has menopaused and there is nothing left. There's no, the hope has gone. And yet still God is saying, it's going to be, you're going to have a legacy. Abraham thinks maybe Lot, we talked about this last week, maybe Lot will be my surrogate son. Maybe it's not about my Yibum-like act to Haran, my brother. Maybe it's Haran's Yibum-like act through his son to me. Haran at least had children. He had Lot, he had Miss Yiska, he had Milcah. So maybe actually Lot will become my surrogate son. And then we saw that the tension with Lot, and Abraham had to let go. He realized that Lot wasn't a good one, and he let Lot go. And it's at this point that Abraham is once again promised, you're going to have your own children. But Abraham can't hold himself back anymore. So here's the text that we find ourselves in. You should be able to see my screen. We're in Genesis 15. After all these things, the word of God came to Abraham in a vision, and he said, "Fear not, Abraham, I am a shield to you, your reward shall be very great." And now he can't hold himself back anymore. But Abraham said, "O Lord God, what can you give me? I'm going to die childless, and the one in charge of my house is the Damascus, meaning the guy from Damascus, Eliezer. My servant, he's going to inherit me. He's going to be the one who's going to take over from me." Who, right? And there's Abraham here says, "Vayomer Avram." Abraham speaks. And the next verse, "Vayomer Avram," Abraham speaks. It's as if God is not responding to him. It seems to be that there is a message here that shouldn't be transmitted yet, that Abraham is sort of asking almost a little bit hastily, a little bit out of turn. God, you're testing me. I know that there's a legacy here, but how is it going to work? What's going to happen? I don't have the ability to have children, and I am quite loyal to this woman. I'm not that I devoted my life to. Like, I am interested in staying with Sarai. Someone asked last week, maybe just find another wife. Well, that's not really the point for Abraham. He's wedded with his disinterest in personal legacy to his wife Sarai. He is wedded to her, to Sarai, my princess. He is wedded to her. But he doesn't understand how this is all going to work. So he says, what's going to happen? And it seems like Hashem doesn't want to say anything. So he speaks again in verse 3. Otherwise, why would it be Vayomer Avram and then Vayomer Avram? It's because there's been like a pause, a pregnant pause. Nothing has happened. No speech has been made. So he speaks again. Hein lo nasata zara. Look, I haven't been given any kids. V'hinei ben beisi yoresh osi. So my steward is going to inherit from me. The idea of inheritance is very, very important. That's something we've been talking about the whole time. The idea of a Yerusha, an inheritance, that's a legacy. He's going to be my legacy. I haven't got Lot. I haven't got my own children. It's going to be my servant. And then comes the punchline. Eliezer is not going to inherit from you. Someone who comes from your loins. Who yirashefa, he will inherit. You're going to have your own biological child. Your own biological child. Who has not been part of this discussion? Your own biological child. First thing to hear at this point. Anyone?
Sarah.
That's right. Sarah has not been part of this discussion. Abraham can have a biological child. That doesn't mean he's going to have it with Sarah. So what happens now is that they go out into this, they go outside and they look into the stars, and you're going to have as many as the stars in the heaven. That's how plentiful your offspring are going to be. But Abraham is going to go. There's now the covenant between the parts, which we'll speak about a little bit. There's a covenant between the parts, and Abraham goes and falls into a deep sleep. Abraham falls into a deep sleep. And when he wakes up in chapter 16, the first thing we're greeted with is Sarai. Sarah, Ashes Avram. We're stressing here, Sarah, the wife of Abraham, Lo Yaldaloi. We've got another indication. The text is telling us again, she hasn't had kids. She hasn't had kids. Now, the first thing to note is that what we're going to try and do today is we're going to try and hear an echoes of the Garden of Eden in this passage. When Abraham, I'm just going back now, there's the covenant between the parts. Abraham is put into a deep sleep, and he's told about a future time. There's another person in the Torah so far who's been put into a deep sleep when they've asked for legacy. Who else in the Torah has asked for legacy? You've not got that many people because we're still only in the fourth parish of the Torah. Who else has asked God for legacy, has said to God, I need someone with me, been put into a deep sleep, and then has met their wife, their wife?
Adam.
Adam, that's right. So Adam wasn't very happy being alone. God said, Lo tov heyosa adam levado. It's not good for you to be alone. He's put into a deep sleep, just as Abraham was put into deep sleep. Whilst he's in a deep sleep, a piece of him is taken, a piece of him is built, make sure we remember that word, a piece of him is built up into Eve, and then Eve is given to him as his wife. And she's named as Isha. The word man is Ish. She's known Isha, which because ki me Ish lukachos, because she was taken from man. She is a part of him. So what does the text seem to be telling us? When Abraham wakes up from his sleep and he's greeted straight away with Sarai, Eshes Avram, Sarai, the wife of Abraham. What's he being told? You want to know who the biological partner is going to be in the creation of this child? It's Sarah. Guess what? The person you were married to until now, she's the one. You thought, how's it going to be? What's it going to happen? It's going to be someone else, just like Adam found this new person. Guess what? It's the same lady. But now the hastiness of Abraham is mirrored in the hastiness of his wife. We're told, Lo yaldalo, she didn't have any kids. Now, Sarah is told by Abraham when she wakes up, guess what? God just told me I'm going to have a biological child. And what does Sarah hear? Yeah, as Simon said, you're going to have a biological child. But you didn't ask God about me. And actually, Rashi over here, I think it's Rashi, or the commentators over here say that that's exactly what happens for Sarah right now. Sarah says, okay, you got that promise, but I didn't. But I tell you what I have. I have an Egyptian maidservant. Who is this Egyptian maidservant, by the way? Well, when Abraham went down to Egypt and there was a breaking down of the loyalty that he showed to his wife, we learned about this last week. He's called her not his wife, he called her his sister, activating instead the relationship of her being the extension of his dead brother, her being his niece. And that was not a lie. It's true that she was his sister, but by calling her his sister, he separated from the loyalty of a husband. We saw that first barrier of Egypt coming in the way between husband and wife. Maybe actually Abraham is saying, my legacy is with Lot. She's my sister, Lot's my son, though. Because I know I'm going to have a legacy. And there's some narcissism coming in here. There's some subjectivity coming in here. There's some of that tree of knowledge of good and evil coming in here. Maybe. So she's my wife. So Egypt comes in between the two, between Abraham and Sarah. So when Abraham finally reveals that actually she's his wife, then Pharaoh sends her away. And Pharaoh sends away Sarah. Pharaoh is so impressed with Sarah and Abraham that he sends after them his own daughter as a maidservant. He sends another princess, Sarai, my princess, Yiscah, the princess. There's another princess now, an Egyptian princess. Velosh Shivcha Mitzvahs, who's now become the Egyptian maidservant in the house of Abraham, Ushma Hagar, and her name is Hagar. Hagar could also be read as Hagar, the stranger. And we'll start to hear, by the way, echoes of the Exodus story, that there is a stranger who is oppressed, and we will be strangers and will be oppressed, and who will oppress us? It'll be the Egyptian. Here there's a stranger called Hagar, she'll be oppressed. She's an Egyptian. So anyway, we've got this lady Hagar, she's a princess, and now Abraham's got two princesses. And Toma Sarai al Avram, Sarah says to Avram, Hinena atzarani, look, I am barren. Hashem has withheld me from having kids. Boinai el shivchasi, come and have relations with my maidservant. Why? Ulai ibanem mimena, maybe I will be built up from her. I said to remember of a word of being built up. Who was built up in the echoes that we've heard so far? We're going quite fast this evening. Who was built up? We said if there's a Garden of Eden echo, and we've just woken up. Pardon?
Eve.
That's right, Justine. So Eve was built from Abraham's so Eve was built from Adam's rib. She was built up, the same language of being built up. Now, that language of building is also a language of sort of technological prowess. That's the language of building that he had from the tower builders. There's a certain creativity coming in here. And Sarah is now no longer Abraham being hasty and interrogating God. Where is my children? Where are my children going to come from? God's not so keen to give him that information. This information is hastily extracted from God. First, God is silent, and Abraham insists. He persists in asking God for the answer. Therefore, that information seems to be dangerous. It seems to hold in it a hastiness, a certain legacy-seeking nature, something that is going to be so difficult for Sarah to contain that she's going to take instead Hagar, who will become Eve in her place. Sarah is woken up to as the wife, but Sarah gives instead of her Hagar. Now Hagar becomes the temptress. Hagar becomes Eve. And remember, what did Eve do to Adam? Eve presented to Adam a fruit of good and evil, meaning Eve presented to Adam subjectivity and the temptation of narcissistic creativity. Now, by Sarah presenting a different princess to Abraham, Eve will become the giver, the provider of that. Hagar will become the provider of that forbidden fruit. And actually, it's almost like we've got two Eves now. We've got Sarah has split herself into two different Eves. There's Sarah the Eve, and there's Hagar the Eve. And there's a very interesting language as well. Vatikach Sarai Eshes Avram, and Sarah, the wife of Abraham, takes as Hagar mitzris shifchasoi. She takes Hagar, the Egyptian maidservant, Miketz es Hashanim, Lasheves Avram be'eretz Canaan. After 10 years, Vatitein Osod Avram Isha lo Isha, and she gives it to Abraham, her husband, to be a wife, to be a lady. In those languages of Isha, again echoes of the garden, another echo of the garden. Vatikach, she takes, Vatitain, and she gives. Which other lady took something and gave it to her husband?
Eve again, yeah.
That's right, Eve again. She takes from the tree of knowledge. She gives good and evil. She gives it to her husband. Sarah, in a hasty act of legacy, in an act where it's about passion, right? Eve said, this tree looks so beautiful. It looks so good. It looks so good to individuate, to be filled with my own creativity. So she takes from the tree and she gives it to her husband. So Sarah takes of her maidservant, gives it to her husband Abraham, because she is hastily seeking out her own legacy. And so Abraham has relations with Hagar and she conceives. But the plan goes awry, because what does she see? What does Hagar see? Hagar sees something. She is also now caught up as an Eve-like player in subjective seeing. She sees that she has conceived. When she sees that, she becomes full of her own power of creativity. Oh, look, I am a creative force. I can contribute to the legacy of Abraham. And her mistress becomes lower in her eyes. Now, what's the last thing? If you're Sarah, what's the last thing that you want to happen? The last thing you want to happen is for your plan, which was that Hagar will be a source of your legacy. The last thing you want is for Hagar to think it's all about Hagar and Abraham's legacy. Abraham's got a new princess. There's a new princess on the block, and it's nothing to do with Sarai anymore. Sarai's out the picture. And so Sarah does something which initially we find very difficult to hear. She oppresses Hagar. So there's the discussion between Abraham and Hagar, and Abraham says, you do what you want with your maidservant, and then the ta'aneha Sarai oppresses her, and then Hagar runs away. What is the way out for Abraham and Sarah? There's a lot more to talk about in the text itself. There are many more echoes to the garden. but we just don't have the time. But we've seen already now, there's a hastiness in Abraham. He grabs onto knowledge that is positioned at the wrong time. He has a baby because Sarah's, that knowledge that was transmitted to Sarah, again, she acted upon hastily. How am I going to have kids? It's not going to be my children, it's going to be someone else's children. Okay, so let's make the plan happen now. Let's jump in. Let's get creativity rolling. And it backfires. What is the way out that they find? What is the resolution to this story? And I'll give you a clue. In the first creation story, which is the creation story in the garden, there is, after all the temptations, there is a covenant that is sealed. It's called Shabbat. In the second creation story, in the story of Noah, another tactic, and by the way, Shabbat, what happens? There's a resolution of creativity where we as mini creators recognize there is a larger creator. Just as a larger creator stopped creating, we too stopped creating. We have to check our own creativity once a week in order to remind ourselves it's not about us, it's about him. That's covenant number one. Covenant number two is in the story of the flood. What's the story? What's the covenant there? It's the covenant of the rainbow. That God says, I will never destroy the world again. By the way, why is it significant to have a covenant of Shabbat, which is desisting from creating, and the covenant of the rainbow, which is not destroying, is because there's two ways that creativity can get out of hand. There's two ways where creativity will undo itself. The first way that creativity will undo itself is if the creator never stops creating. If the creator, like for example, if a painter never stops painting, they will never ever have a finished piece of work. They will just continue painting forever and ever and ever, and they will never have created something. So anytime that there is a creating, there has to be a stopping from creating. The final act of creating is to stop creating. That is the finale. That is when I say job done. And the same thing, like as you experience as a parent, or as you experience as a child, or you experience with a project, there is a point where you say, job done, I have to stop now, right? Mom, stop now. There is a point where you have to say done, because it's actually, otherwise I'm just becoming an extension of someone else. That child is just an extension of me. At a certain point, I have to say the child is doing their own thing. I made them as an independent individual. I was made as an independent individual. That project now has a life of its own beyond my tinkering. It is now done. It has to now run its course. The painting has to be finished. So that's the first covenant, is the covenant of Shabbat, when a creator stops. The other time a creator can undo its creating is when a painter looks at the painting and rips it up. I've had enough. I'm done. I'm not doing anything more with this. Or a parent destroys a child, or a child is destroyed by a parent, or a project is undone, it's sabotaged. So that's the second covenant. The second covenant is the covenant of the flood, which is where God says, I'm ripping up the canvas. And then he says, I'm never going to rip up the canvas again. And both times God is saying, you have to understand that this is two ways of relating to creativity and putting a check on creativity, not stopping from creativity, not destroying my creativity. And what's the third covenant that brings this to some sort of resolution in the story of Abraham?
Not the Arcada, is it?
No, we're going to get to the Arcada because we can't not get to the Arcada. But no, there is a covenant that sort of brings this to a finale, which allows us to continue despite the temptations.
Covenant with Yaakov.
Not yet. I'll give you a clue that the
But
word
marriage.
Brit Milah.
Marriage?
Thank you very much, Dan. Right.
Brit Milah.
That's right. That's right. So the word for covenant is Brit. We just sometimes call it Brit Milah. It's a Brit, but Brit Milah is the covenant of circumcision. A covenant is a pact. So there's a covenant called Brit Milah. That's a very unique covenant. Covenant of Shabbat, there's no minor surgery involved. Covenant of the rainbow, there is a prism in the sky. Covenant of Brit Milah, there's minor surgery involved. What's going on with the covenant of Brit Milah? Because this does seem to make things move along. It's just after the Brit Milah, you'll recall in this week's parasha, that Abraham has given the message, you and Sarah are going to have a son. You and Sarah are going to have a son. He laughs. It is laughable. So laughable, in fact. These elderly people, postmenopausal, barren and infertile for their whole marriage, they're going to have a son. Yes, his name is Laughter, little Laughter. His name is Isaac. Just after Abraham has done something, he has put a sign in the sort of metaphorical source of his very biological creativity. God's been saying, you're going to be a biological creator. That's made him be hasty. It's made him be hasty to ask questions. It's made Sarah hasty to think it's going to be only Abraham's creativity and not her own. And she wants a piece of the pie. She wants to be built up like Eve was built up. It's made a split of the garden. But there's a way out of this, is that maybe Abraham can channel that creativity still. What do? I cut away the covering. I cut away the outer garment, the externality. I cut away my subjectivity. I'm just left with a sign on that very place of my creativity. That point of passion, of narcissism, of self-serving, there's going to be a sign right there. And actually, the text puts the onus of that covenant on humanity. Just go back into the text. So they have Abraham and Hagar have Ishmael, and then God visits Abraham and he says, I'm El Shaddai, walk in my ways and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you. I'll make you exceedingly numerous. Abraham throws himself down on the floor and Abraham's name is changed. You're no longer going to be Abraham, you're going to be Abraham. There's a whole lot of textual analysis here, but it's fine. But what we get to is that I will make you exceedingly fertile, and make nations of you, and kings shall come forth from you. That means that there's still that promise, that promises still need to be fulfilled. I'll maintain my covenant between me and you and your offspring to come as an everlasting covenant throughout the ages, to be God to you and to your offspring to come. So I'm going to be steadfast with you, says God. And you're going to have to be steadfast with me. I'm going to give you the land. As for you, your offspring to come throughout the ages shall keep my covenant. Now you have to be steadfast with me. Such shall be the covenant between me and you, and your offspring to follow, which you shall keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. And you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and that shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. You're going to have to do it yourself, guys. Covenants are binding on both ways. Shabbat is binding, that God says, I'm going to stop creating. I'm going to allow my creation to exist. But you're going to have to keep Shabbat too. You're going to have to remember what that means. This covenant is binding too. You're going to have to do something for me. You're going to have to demonstrate with your bodies that there is a rectification that needs to go on, that you need to channel your creativity to something higher. And it's at that point that we escape the trap of the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is the balance between, is it all for God? Is it all for someone else? Or is it all for me? And we kept on falling into the trap of it being for me. Now there's a new path, a path where it is me for God. It is me. There is a real me, but it's designated. It's given a sign. It's focused. It's channeled into a higher purpose. That's what the covenant tells us can happen. And then Isaac comes along. It seems to be a new way that Abraham is able to take his own talents and passions, sort of like we said, the example of Rabbi Sachs before. Someone is able to take all that talent, all that intellect, all that ability, but use it for a higher purpose. That is the greatest fulfillment of the covenant of circumcision. We take something, we direct it, and we don't make it about my own narcissism, we make it about something bigger. Pause. Thoughts, reflections before we jump into the Akedah, because that's the next level. Sorry that I've been talking for like 45 minutes.
If God is making this covenant with Abraham for all his generations, why is it necessary to have a further covenant at Mount Sinai?
That's a great question. And I'm going to just give a very brief answer to that, because I think because of time, but there is a covenant of being part of the Jewish family, which is about channeling my creativity. It's about that focus that we spoke about. There's a covenant of being part of the Jewish people, which is about learning the method of spreading out God's light into the world. And that's the covenant of the Torah. So it's an intensification, it's an extension, it's the next level of that covenant. It's not the covenant of a family that exists in a selfless way, or rather that uses their talents for good. It's the covenant of a nation that is going to stand for morality in the world, and that's what you need the rules for. Okay. We could have said that Abraham's story ends there. Abraham's story ends with a covenant, but clearly it doesn't end with a covenant. Clearly there are more stories that happen, and we meet Hagar and Ishmael again, but possibly the most tricky Abraham story, the one that really maybe you could write off Abraham as a result of, is the story of the Akedah, the story of the binding of Isaac. And we've got 14 minutes to go to do something with the Akedah, which is really not enough time. And I also want to introduce a textual sort of tool to you in the process of opening up the Akedah. I'm just going to ask maybe the most difficult question about the Akedah. Abraham, villain or hero? What do you say? Abraham is willing to sacrifice his son to bind him to a rock and slit his throat. Villain or hero? Or villain or hero? What do you say?
Neither.
Neither. Okay. Simon, that's called sitting on the fence.
No, it's not.
Hero.
He's not a hero. He did an act that he felt he had to do.
What did they do?
That doesn't make him heroic.
Okay, so one answer is that he's not a hero, but he's not a villain. He's not a villain. Okay.
Villain because he's doing it for the second time.
Pardon?
Villain because he's doing it for the second time.
Doing it for the second time. What do you mean?
Well, he sent Ishmael out, and Ishmael almost died.
Right. He's sending another child out to get lost. And actually, it's interesting because our Ishmaelite cousins, their version of this story is that Ishmael is the one who's bound on the rock and is offered up, or is attempted to be offered up, rather than Isaac. So yeah, that's an interesting one.
In order to be a villain, you have to break a law.
I mean, I think there is a law not to murder your children.
What's that?
So we said that Abraham was a someone who's intuited the Torah, who understood what morality was, and that's how he came to God. So if he understood that there was, and that's why he also was a person who stood against child sacrifice. That's what was the sort of de rigueur of the day in the idolatrous practices of Ur-Kasdim in Mesopotamia. But Abraham stood against that. He was the one who said that's wrong. There is one loving God, not these brutal pantheon of idols that must be appeased with my child's sacrifice. So I think Abraham seemed to have felt that this was wrong from what he was spreading to the world. And you could say that some of that's midrash. That's okay. I'm willing to sort of like use that midrash for the purposes of this. But I think he felt that he thought this was wrong. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been spending his whole life trying to preach something else. And
also Sarah dies.
And Sarah is heartbroken by the idea that, again, this is a medrash, this is not in the text, but she is shown a vision of Abraham sacrificing her son, and she clearly doesn't see this as a good thing. She dies from heartbreak.
One thing that's always struck me as strange is that Abraham was able and willing to argue with God about Sodom and Gomorrah, yet we don't see him arguing with God about killing his own son.
Right.
So, is there an element here of what you were saying before, Rabbi, about the narcissism? Because after all this time, they've got this child who could be their child, it's their thing, and this was a reminder that in fact it's not about them and it's not about their legacy, because the legacy belongs to God.
So we will get there, but maybe.
Sorry to keep butting in. The other thing I would say is that if God has promised you that the nations will come through you, and he miraculously gives you a son at whatever crazy age they were, he could do the same again. So it may just be that it wasn't Isaac it was meant to be through. So you can understand why it wouldn't feel the same to Abraham as it would to us.
You could contend the other way. that Abraham has been spending his whole life seeking out legacy and waiting and waiting. It's not, is it going to be with my, I'm going to have a legacy with Yiska. No, she's barren. Oh, maybe it'll be Lot. No, Lot's not a good one. Maybe it'll be Lot again. That's why I get him back. No, Lot's taken away again. Oh, so maybe it'll be through Ishmael. No, it's not going to be through Ishmael. Finally, it's through Isaac. Isaac is the one who will be my legacy. It's not going to be Eliezer, the servant. It's going to be Isaac. I've been waiting this whole time. Sarah's waiting this whole time. There's been hiccups along the way. And now finally we have Isaac. And God's promised that. God promised that I'd have Isaac and Isaac will be my legacy. And now he's being taken away. So it's the absolute frustration, not just of my own personal hopes and dreams, but it's also the frustration seemingly of God's position. Or maybe, Simon, you can say it this way, that it's more like what Joe was saying, that finally there's the test, which is that up until now, sort of the promises have been somewhat consistent with what Abraham wanted, but because Abraham wanted legacy, at least even a kind legacy, and God wanted him to have a legacy, and now it's being taken away. Now God's saying, maybe you don't have a legacy anymore. The whole thing is falling apart. The interesting thing, though, is that we've been sort of skirting around the possible villainous nature of Abraham being a child killer, but the Rosh Hashanah davening and the rapturous support of God after the episode where he says, now I see that you had faith in me, God seems to think it was a good thing that Abraham did what he did. And our Rosh Hashanah davening seems to hold up the great merit of the forefathers is that Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son. And, you know, however you rationalize this, that just at the moment, that seems incredibly problematic. Because even if at some point you say, Abraham's a great man, he's just following orders, he's neither a hero nor a villain, because he's just following orders, it's his son. It's his son. What do you do with this? What do you do with this lullaby?
Could I just say, ask something?
Yes, Dad.
Thanks. You've got two men going up a mountain. There's no one else there. You've got Abraham, who is, 100 and something by now, and his son, who is 39, nearly 40 years old.
Yeah.
It's got to be more than just Abraham and his son. This has got to be between two grown men going on here. And the fact that they came down afterwards, arm in arm, must show that there was more to this than just take your son and go and slit his throat.
Well, I'm interested in the idea. You're right that according to the calculations here, Isaac is not like a little boy that we sometimes have the picture of. But still, Isaac was willing to lie down, to let himself be bound on a rock, and to lift his neck up so that Abraham could kill him. So Isaac is maybe not happy about the situation, but it seems like he's going along with it. So if this is what Dad's saying, and Dad's getting this from God, so Isaac is submitting himself to this. But I've got little bit of time left, and I want to share with you a way of looking at this text, which is revolutionary. I think it's again from Rabbi David Foreman, and it is a beautiful look at the text. And I want to, by looking at the text, I want to introduce something about the text itself, which was, when I first saw it, this was an absolute innovation. Imagine, up until normally when we think about Torah text and we think about understanding Torah text, we think about the text itself as one thing and commentary as something outside the text. For example, we say, there's the text and there's Rashi, or there's the text and there's Medrash, and so the text itself is what it is, and then other people come along and comment on the text. What would you say if I suggested that the text could comment on itself, that the text could offer up its own commentary? It's almost like it was written in such a way to have its own method of talking about itself. Now, that's sort of interesting. It's like the text exists on multiple levels. We have spoken about that in the last series of Chasing Lullabies, the 4 different levels of understanding text. But here we're talking about structural form, a form of the text, whereby the text is trying to show us or point us to a particular moment that it wants to draw our attention to. How would it do such a thing? So there's something called a chiasm. A chiasm, I don't know if we talked about this in the last series, but a chiasm is is a device which is an ABA device or an ABCBA device. Essentially, you go from the way that chiastic structure is found in Hebrew is you match the beginning with the end. So, for example, if you have the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, which is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, is married to Sof or Taf, which is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Bet, the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, is married to Shin, which is the second to last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So A, B, B, C, C, until you get to a middle point, a central point. And a chiasm in the Torah often is used. God writes the Torah with chiasms throughout, which can be unearthed if you look for them. And the chiasms show a midpoint. So normally we think about the Torah in a linear fashion. You go from the beginning of the binding of Isaac's story through to the middle and all the way till the end. So, for example, you start with a command to Abraham to go and kill his son and offer him up as a sacrifice. You go to the middle part, they're climbing up the mountain onto Mount Moriah, and you've come to the end, the happy resolution where the angel calls out to Abraham, and Abraham, and Abraham responds, "Hineni, here I am," and he says, don't offer up your son. This was just a test. Here's a ram. Off you go and blow the shofar. So we have that linear structure normally of a story, but a chiasm actually finds a middle point within the story. And that middle point can be one of two things. Either that middle point can be the focus, it's like the center of gravity for the whole story, or it can be a tipping point whereby the different parts on either side of the chiasm, the A and the A and the B and the B, can now be reinterpreted in light of that balance. And so I want to share with you a chiasm in the story of the binding of Isaac, which will show us, I think, the great test that Abraham had and the great balance he expresses between his own creativity, his own legacy, and the legacy of God. So just as an example of where the chiasm might be found, we'll start to see it, that in verse 6, Vayikach Avraham, Abraham takes es atzeh ha'olah, the wood of the offering, Vayasem al Yitzchak beno. So what's the image over here? The image is of Abraham taking wood and putting it onto his son. He's arranging it onto his son, who is the offering. What's the opposite? What's the one on the other side? That's the A. What's the A on the other side? And the green over here, he arranges the wood, and now he puts his son on top of the wood, right? So this is a sort of a link in, but it's a flip. So the first one is the wood's on top of the sun. Then in the last part, the sun's on top of the wood. As we go in from those sort of bookends of the chiasm, we get further and further towards the middle. The next part is as he takes in his hand the fire and the knife, and the two of them walk together. Towards the end, just after they've had a conversation, there's another repeat of this phrase, the two of them walk together. By the way, if you expand out the chiasm, and we'll just hold on to this thought for the end of the learning this evening, I'm going to have to go on for another 5 minutes, I'm sorry. But at the, I hope that's okay. So at the beginning of this whole story of Abraham and Isaac and the Akedah and the binding, one second. Oh, we've got to go quite a bit further on. Got past Sodom and Gomorrah. We just totally missed that out. And so okay, I'm not going to find it in the text right now. Here we are. It's all right. It's all right. Here it is. Here it is. Hasty. Okay, so the beginning of the story of the binding of Isaac here in chapter 22. We begin with Vahi Achad Varma'ela. After these things, God tested Abraham and says to him, Abraham, Vayomer Hineni, and he says, here I am. That's really the A of this chiasm. The first part of this chiasm, he says, where else have you heard a heavenly being calling out to God, calling out to Abraham, and Abraham responding, Hineni, here I am. So you hear that just as Abraham is about to sacrifice his son, in verse 11, so we've now gone 10 verses on, the angel of the Lord calls out from heaven, he calls out to him, Abraham, and he says, here I am. So you've got God calling out to Abraham at the beginning, saying, and Abraham responding, Hineni, here I am in my entire self. And at the end, also when he's been called out by God, by the angel, he's been called out Abraham, and he says, Hineni, here I am. That's A and A. We move in from A and A to the next part, the wood being put on Isaac, or the Isaac being put on the wood. Then we've got the three of them, the two of them walk together, and the two of them walk together. And in the middle, we have now a conversation in verses 7 and 8, which will have 5 different vayomers. Let's just count them. Okay, so verses 7 and 8, it's easier for me in Sepharia. So vayomer, and this is the middle of the chiasm. Vayomer Yitzchak el Avraham Aviv. Isaac says to Abraham, his father, Vayomer Avi, he says, and so another Vayomer, he says, Dad. Vayomer, and he says, Hineni v'ni, here I am, my son. Vayomer, and he says, Hinei ha'esh v'etzim, here is the fire and the wood, v'ayeh haser la'olah. Where is the sheep for the slaughter, for the elevation offering? Vayomer Abraham, and Abraham says, Elohim, God, yireh haser la'olah b'ni. God will show you the sheep for the offering, my son. Vayelchu shnehem yachdav, and the two of them walk together. It's interesting. So we've got 5 different vayomers. We'll have to work. Why would you have 5 different vayomers? 5 different and he said, and he said, and he said, and he said. It must be that each time that there's an and he said, the conversation is being moved on. The conversation is taking a new sort of changing gear. Okay, and so we see that something is bothering Isaac. Vayomer, Isaac says, Hinei ha'esh v'ha'etzim. Here is the fire, here's the wood. Va'ayeh haser la'olah. But where is the ser? Where's the sheep for the elevation offering? The word, there's 2 ways you can ask where is something. You can either say a for, where is it? Or you can say ayeh. What's the difference between an a for or an ayeh? Here it's saying ayeh. A for is a factual question. Where is this? Like, where is it? I don't know. Like, did we leave it back behind in base camp? That's a for. Ayeh is much more a call out. What's going on here? What's going on? This doesn't make sense. Nothing makes sense about this. Dad, where's the offering? Am I the offering? And Abraham responds with a very, very strange phrase. Vayomer Avraham says anew, an intensification of the conversation, because it's once again another Vayomer. He says, Elohim, God, yireh lo, will show for him haser. God will see it. God will show for us the sheep, la'olah b'ni, for the elevation offering, my son. What does that word, my son, refer to? It could just be the finishing off of the statement, like, eat your supper, Yiska, my daughter, right? It could just be like a label. Hashem will show to you the offering, my son. Or there's an ambiguity there. Maybe Hashem will show to you the offering, my son. That you're going to be the offering. And that ambiguity in the statement may be true. Maybe we don't know. Maybe Abraham doesn't know what's going on here. Abraham is doing what he's told. He's taking his son up the mountain, but it doesn't make any sense. A man who is serving an all-loving God, a God who's promised that his legacy, that Abraham's legacy through Isaac, will be the perpetuation of light and goodness in this world, a perpetuation of a legacy of covenant, a legacy of Brit Milah, a legacy of channeling my creativity to something higher, is telling me to destroy it all. He doesn't know. So what can Abraham do at the top of the mountain? And it's here we come to the center of the chiasm. I said to you there were 5 vayomers. We've just dealt with the last 2. Isaac saying, where's the sheep? Where? Like, what's going on? Ayeh, not aphor. Abraham saying, I really don't know, my son. Hashem's sorting this one out. There's three, but those are the last. That was vayomers 4 and 5. What's 1, 2, 3? But 3 is going to be the very middle part. So let's do 1 and 2, and then we'll get to 3. Vayomer Yitzchak el Avraham Aviv. Isaac says to Abraham his father. They're talking. They're going up the mountain. Isaac is speaking to his father. Yeah, my father mentioned that Isaac's not a young. It's not a young man. He's well, I mean, he's a young man, but he's not that young. So they're talking. They're talking, and all of a sudden, as he's speaking to his father, Vayomer Avi, he says, "Dad." He says, "Father, my father." It's like they've been having, some sort of conversation, and Isaac realizes something strange is going on, and he has to call out. He says, and that call is an intensification, another vayomer, an intensification of the conversation. Dad! If you're Abraham, what's the last word you want to hear come out of the mouth of Isaac at this moment in time? The last word you want to hear coming out of the mouth of your son at this moment in time is a word that attests to your relationship. I could imagine if a person was about to commit murder, they want to dehumanize the other person. They want to cut off all relationship to the other person. They don't want to feel anything. The last thing you want to hear as you're walking up the mountain ready to slaughter your son is the word dad. And what does Abraham respond? What one thing is left for Abraham that he can do that's within his control? He doesn't know what's going to happen. We already saw that ambiguity in his statement. The thing that he can have control over, Vayomer hineni bani. Here I am, my son. That's the one thing he has control over. Here I am, my son. I'm still your father. I love you. I am still entirely here, dedicated to you. My creativity was going to be expressed is expressed in two ways. My creativity is expressed in the hineni that I say to Hashem at the beginning of this statement. In the hineni that I express to Hashem at the beginning of this story. In the hineni that I say to Hashem at the end of this story, the bookends of our chiasm. And in the very center of the chiasm, there's another hineni. Here I am in all myself, in all what I am, and my whole heart is dedicated to you, the other expression of my creativity to give to my son. You are still my son. If you want to know what is the true test of Abraham in the Akedah, is can he say hineni to God and still say hineni to his son? Can he maintain his loyalty, his selfless loyalty as father to a son and as son to God? Can he maintain that ability to say hineni, here I am? Can he channel all his creativity outside of himself? It's never about him anymore. It's only about a split between the creativity, his love for his son, all that he could do, all that he could build, but also all for Hashem. And I haven't fully kind of put together all the thoughts here. But if you want to think about how we could join up the past 4 sessions of conversations, the conversations about my own narcissistic desires, my own desire for legacy, my own desire for goodness rather than truth, the need to eat of the forbidden fruit, the hastiness of what it means to seek out my own legacy. And then you want to see the balance that is found after Brit, the balance that is found after the circumcision covenant, the balance that is put to the ultimate test on the top of Mount Moriah, as Abraham is forced to say, is tested to say, can he say hineni to God, but also at the very center of a chiasm, at the very center of a textual mountain, as we've gone from AA, hineni, BB, wood on Isaac, Isaac on wood, CC, the two of them, the two of them walking together, and then 5 vayomers, almost a vayomer with the mountain of that vayomer, a hineni which matches the bottom of the mountain on either side, a mountain of text, God commenting what's the center, what's the gravity pulling our text to. Can you also say hineni b'ni, here I am for you, my son? My legacy can be spread across that entire mountain and still channeled in the right direction. That's Abraham's journey as he reaches the height of his mountain. What might that mean for us? I think it can mean many things. Possibly, I think the message that I take out from this whole journey that we've done over the past 4 sessions, and that we will continue to hear echoes of, but we will move on from this idea of separation and coming back. We'll move on into the lives of Isaac, Jacob, and then the Joseph saga. Is when I feel all what it means to be a powerful, talented, special human being, and all of us are powerful, talented, special human beings with our own unique unique strengths and unique contributions, when I know all of those things, I'm an Abraham, I'm a son of Abraham, and there is loyalty that is being tested in all directions, can I say with the fullest expression of myself, Hineni, but not for me. Here I am, but not for me. Here I am for the greatest goodness. Even if that pulls me apart to say Hineni B'ni as well as Hineni to Hashem, can I still say Hineni for a greater cause? Can I be true to that Brit? Can I be true to that covenant, that I will channel all of that, what it means to be a special child of Abraham, to bring greater light into this world? The Ilin Nishmas Rabbi Sachs, may we all take that message and channel that light. Thank you for chasing away the lullabies with me this evening. So special to have you here. I'll look forward to chasing away the lullabies again next week.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop the live stream and then take any comments and questions for people that want to stay on.